Hey folks, welcome to another episode of RPG Hour on Twitch. I am Mr. RPG Hour. I am joined by, if y'all will introduce yourselves.
I'll go first. Hi, I'm Cliff. I go by Space Moose 34 on Twitter. I do game design and editorial work, mostly with a buddy of mine at Spilldale Studios, also on Twitter at Spilldale.
Hi, I'm Eric, also known as Eldritch Crow. You can find me as that pretty much anywhere. Usually just ranting about TTRPG stuff or currently school.
As of today, we are going to be talking about science fantasy or space fantasy, as some people call it. And we're going to be focused on like the technology in these types of games and related media. And I say related media because last time we're like, in tabletop role playing games, and we talked about like non tabletop role playing game stuff as well. So I'm adding in related media this time because I'm going to start with my favorite that I think has done it the best, in my personal opinion. I think that Disney's Treasure Planet is
Oh, absolutely.
one of the best melding of science fantasy. It's got a great science fiction foothold as well as a great fantasy hold as well. I would have loved to have seen a little bit more on the fantasy side, the with like magic or psionic abilities or something. But I feel that it's been one of the best meldings. And then when we get to the tabletop role playing game space, I feel like we don't have as much of that going on. We've got Star Wars. And I mean, if you really look at a lot of Star Wars, it is basically fantasy in space with a sprinkle of science fiction. Um,
I 100% agree with you there. We're seeing a little bit of growth in that direction now with more on like the live play, like actual play side of things and the actual TTRPGs dev, I would feel. Just because I see a lot of people that want that genre, so they just go and make a show and play a certain system for it. I think the latest TTRPG I saw that even gets close to this would be probably Burn Bright,
Mhm.
in terms of just stuff that's sort of out there and released. But then again, I think I've missed a couple of releases in the indie TTRPG scene lately as well. But yeah, I 100% agree on the Treasure Planet front, by the way. And I think the only reason why we didn't get more of like weird alien psionic or magic stuff is just runtime.
yeah, and I know that they have this weirdness to them about when Disney does stuff like this. Like, let's see how people like it, and then sometimes they're like, "Oh, you have an audience? Well, it's not the audience we want, so we're just not going to keep going."
Right. Right.
Yeah, also Treasure Planet was one of those weird niche ones where like it was in that sort of transition period for Disney too, where it never got as much attention as it really should have. But outside of my general opinions on how well it did, I feel like it blended sort of the overall golden age of piracy aesthetic with science fiction very, very well. Um, and I think part of that too is I'm gonna be honest. I think the difference between science fiction and science fantasy is that science fantasy doesn't necessarily care about explaining all its sci-fi bullshit.
Right.
Whereas science fiction very often tries to at least even half-ass an explanation. I think science fantasy is like, no, this is just the either the aesthetic we're going for, or this is just what happens, and you're not going to get an explanation. You just have to trust us on it.
Or the
I think it.
explanation. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I was just gonna say I feel like it places the um, I'll call it the burden of understanding or the burden of explanation more on the audience than it does on the presenter, I guess would be the better choice of words there.
The only other time that you really do see it in science fantasy is when they're like, okay, we have to explain something because it's going to be a plot point or an adventure point, or and you get a lot of that with D&D Spelljammer.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
don't get me wrong, I'm a huge Spelljammer fan, but at the same time, I'm like, I want more there's a whole section of stuff that you could have done and you walked away. And it's like at this point it's like people are like, let's bring back Spelljammer. And I'm over here like, no, let's build something new with new people. And
But
I
we have to be a bit careful there because that also touches on like we kind of hit on this our last talk too about like how much of D&D is bogged down by its own history one and by people just wanting to go back to that old history too.
Mhm.
Whereas, like I mentioned Burn Bright earlier, I feel like Burn Bright is a great step in the right direction for sci-fi or TTRPGs. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but everything I see about it is just rave reviews, which is wonderful. Because I'll be honest, I think straight fantasy RPGs are sort of overrepresented in this space. I'm down for more sci fantasy. Numenera has made a huge resurgence in the past like year and a half because of Modding Cook Games, and it's amazing. I love that, and I love that they're doing 5e compatible versions of all their stuff for it too, because it also means that hey, we have our own system for this, but we also want it to breach a broader market. So how do we do that? Well, you write for 5e is how you do that, unfortunately. But
See, Numenera for me tickles a weird space because it doesn't feel like it really hits fantasy enough. It doesn't feel like it really hits like science fantasy enough for me either. But then it like hits this weird like post-apocalyptic itch.
Mhm.
And it really does like I've played in games that are completely just not that. But like when I read the book, I just get this weird like itch in the back of my head as this is capitalists trying to stay alive as the world goes asunder, and this is religion trying to stay alive as the world goes asunder, and it has a very post-apocalyptic feel for me. But and I think that that's the thing is sometimes with science fantasy we end up with this almost weird post-apocalyptic feel. 80s movies like Krull has that. It is very much a science fantasy. Um,
Dune had it too.
yeah, Dune, and Dune hits that real weird space where it is like almost hard sci-fi, and
I
then
I would I would say it definitely is hard sci-fi. It's just weirdly placed in its own like time, I
It's
guess, its
very
own timeline.
it's very localized. Most of your major sci-fi, strays towards space opera, where you're spanning the galaxy, or even if you're talking about something in like The Expanse, you know, the drama is multi-planets, large scale, this sort of thing, where the drama for Dune a lot of times is still very much localized, and so that localization helps with the science fantasy feel of it, at least in my purview of it. And the thing that kind of gets me with you were talking about Numenera, Dune, Dark Sun to a degree where you have that post-apocalyptic feel is the idea of like a utopian space. Like for me, science fiction and sci fantasy have a more utopian feel to it, kind of similar to science fiction, where we've expanded either to the stars or someone has, and it's very big ideals where the more post-apocalyptic things like Crow and Dark Sun and Numenera, still have that kind of you know everything is fading and decaying, and you've got to get what you can with this outrageous technology or the remnants of it, and I think that's kind of uh, a real big facet of it is that sort of utopianism that you have to tie into it. So,
Yeah, and there's an element of like fatalism there too, where I find the points where like science fiction and post-apocalypse stuff really cross over is when you have the story turns on a point of okay, this is one person or a small group of people affecting the course of much larger things, or this is a person or group of people that ultimately don't have a whole lot of an impact. And that's really where the difference between post-apocalypse and sci-fi hit for me, and also where you can start getting some interesting mixed tones as well. So like for example, technically the Hunger Games is a sci-fi story. It has a lot of the aesthetic, it has a lot of the play of a sci-fi story, but ultimately there's this fatalism to it where it's like, no, 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 this society has gone through its own social apocalypse. It
Hmm.
is bleak. It is utopian for some, but not for others. And while I may not exceptionally like how it was done, it stands as a very good example of the intersection of the two. Um, for me, I've always felt like sci fantasy and sci fi are like so closely tied. I've always felt like the devil is in the details.
Hmm.
Really, it's in execution and it's in just how far are you willing to go to make this all make sense.
Right.
Um,
No, you
Basically.
bring up a really good point, and I think I would break it down is the difference between that small group of people affecting the change versus that small group of people that were focused on being affected by the change or resisting it to a degree. And circling it back around to tabletop RPGs, our games, for the most part, for the longest part, from the founding of tabletop RPGs, have been about the players, small group of people affecting the change. It's only in more recent times, more recent games, where you are basically enduring the change and you're, reacting to it, and that's how the story is built. And that may be why it's more difficult at times to sort of capture it in play, because you want your characters to be the story as opposed to the story happening to them.
Yeah, and that hits on an interesting like intersection of TTRPG space too, because I feel like where when it comes to tabletop games specifically, the games where players affect change are the games that are usually heroic based. They are D&D, they are your Numeneras and that sort of thing. Whereas the games that have the players being affected by change feel much more like horror games,
Right.
really. Um, 10 Candles is a great example. We had a game of 10 Candles happen as part of RPG Hour as well. And even though I wasn't there, the one thing I was very intrigued by through the game's construction was, oh, you have a ticking clock on the game.
Mm-hmm.
You have to make choices, and then when that clock ticks down, you don't get to make choices anymore. Which is a very like it's a very intriguing way to create pressure, but it's also sort of taking agency away from the players in a specific view as well. So really that does support a lot of what you're saying when it comes to sci-fi and sci-fantasy as well, in that dichotomy of like, okay, are you going to make waves or are you not going to?
Right.
I think a very good example of sci-fi where it's like, all right, you're going to be affected by a big radical change here is the Aliens franchise, where like, all right, you got a bunch of people in a space station or in a spaceship that find one small thing. And yes, Aliens is also a horror movie, but it's very, very strongly coded as sci-fi, where it's like, all right, these people are used to a specific status quo brought about by technology, brought about by their social scenarios. That status quo is going to change now because, hey, we discovered an alien life form for the first time and it wants to eat our faces. And that's a wonderful breakdown of it. I think Treasure Planet kind of hits on that as well, because you have one teenage kid who winds up finding an entire lost treasure, except the entire lost treasure is a planet with teleportation gateways.
Right.
Well,
Like,
sorry.
it's amazing. Sorry, go ahead.
And if we games like Traveler that have been around for a long time, that are hard sci-fi, most people don't dig too deep into some of the more extended lore. And the rules got easier and more complicated over the years. And there's a section called the Spinward Marches. I am probably not remembering this correctly. It's been years since I've run or played this, but this part of the universe has an entire section of humans that are completely psionic based. Like their entire culture is built around the fact that almost everybody has psionics. And in that same area of space, there's a place called the Sword Worlds where technology varies hugely, and you get planets that look like they would fit into the Firefly series. So you literally
Nice.
have a hard sci-fi universe, and then you go all the way over to this one little area, and if you looked at it, you're like, oh, hey, this is really cool. It almost has a sci fantasy feel. And then when you remember that the Imperium is run by like there are people that are dukes and duchesses and marquises and things like that, you get like drawn into where if you really focus on that style of the Imperium and not the sort of stormtrooper side of it, you get like drawn back into, you could really run a science fantasy with Traveler. And if you use the older Traveler rules with like newer spacefaring rules from like one of the newer Travelers, it goes so smoothly. It's one of those things that if you were to run it, that would honestly be one of the systems that I would go to if I wanted less crunch, because your character sheet can literally be written on half of a note card depending on your handwriting, and that's everything you need to play for your character.
That's amazing. I love that. At the same time, too, I wonder if science fiction and science fantasy have kind of been a bit slower on the uptake for players just because of scope. Uh, just because of like, I wonder if the idea of having multiple planets and multiple galaxies gets overwhelming for game runners and overwhelming for players as well. Um, just because I, I could see that. I could see that being a bit of an issue, and I could also see designers getting a little bit in the weeds on it as well, with regards to doing just too much lore. You know, the one thing I will say about D&D is that due to them being a heavily regimented production cycle, I don't see them ever having a problem with having too much lore because their cycle for drip feeding information is actually very, very well done. That's one thing I'll give them. But I worry that, or I wonder maybe that sci-fi might just feel a bit too big for people to run at their tables.
I think that that's definitely right there. I mean, we look at Star Wars, and people don't have an issue running Star Wars, but let's be honest, they treat it like a quick blurb. You're on Tatooine. It's a sand planet. There you go. And people are like, oh, okay. You're on Dagobah. It's a swamp planet. Go. And I think that because the movies do that, like you're literally flying into, except for like the new ones, which is the only thing that bugged me about the new movies is that we don't get like a title of what planet it is above the planet. Like that's the one thing. Honestly, I loved the new movies. That's the only thing that bugged me is I was like, that's not there. What planet is this?
It's also one thing Guardians of the Galaxy did extremely well.
Yeah,
Was like they used their title cards
Right.
supremely.
and the thing is that if you were to pick up Traveler in almost any era of Traveler, there is so much lore out there pre-built, and at the same time, creating a planet that your character comes from, that your character originates on, is so simple and quick that like it's not even funny. Like you can literally create a blurb that is just a bunch of little numbers and just a couple of lines of text that you create a whole planet or a whole system based on this, and you don't even have to worry about it. That's all that you really ever have to do or say. And so you can get that quick, easy feel from Traveler. But what I've seen from a lot of other games is there's either nothing at all, so lore fans can't get it, but there's also like not really a quick build system. It's just like cool, game master go, and I think that that's where people flounder for a lot of these other science fiction games and science fantasy stuff. I think is that they feel like they have to come up with so much for planets. Literally, there's stuff from the original Traveler that I go back and grab for other science fiction and science fantasy type games because it's pre-built in. If I'm doing space, I'm actually going to go back to those 1970, I think they're 1977, 1978 books or something like that, or maybe even a little bit later. I'm going to grab those
I
because
feel like I feel like you bring up a very interesting point here as well as like how much fantasy specifically is part of our current pop culture zeitgeist, but science fiction, science fantasy still lag behind a little bit. So people have much more familiarity with fantasy and and much more comfort with fantasy, versus having sci-fi, which really the two top sci-fi genre or sci-fi IPs, I would say, in popular culture, in my mind, are the Aliens franchise and Star Wars. Like those are the two big hits right now. The Expanse is recent, but it hasn't had life or the lifespan, I would say, of either of those to really sit into people's memories and become something that other people base things on. But like you look at Aliens and Star Wars, and like everything kind of spins out of those to a certain degree. Now, on the other side of that, I also feel like sci-fi creates choice paralysis in a weird way, where it's like, okay, where do I start? Whereas for fantasy, you're like, okay, I want this feel. I know something with this feel already exists, so I can borrow some beats from that and know I'm going in the right direction. Whereas sci-fi, you don't really have a lot of that because the aesthetics of it can vary so wildly. Um,
Well, see, I was going to say something kind of to the opposite of what both of you were saying to a degree, um, because I'm a huge Trek. I'm a huge Star Trek nerd,
oh
and
God, Star Trek! I should have mentioned that.
no,
I
that's all
feel
right.
a fool.
And you know, having a background in science and all stuff. If I was building, and we kind of touched on this last time, I'm building a game, building a system that has that overlap between science and fantasy. The hard part for me is stopping the crunchiness with the science because how in depth do I go? Like one of my favorite books when I was a young nerdling was the Star Trek technical manual from the Next Generation. And pretty much it had blueprints and layouts and explanations and all the techno babble for everything everywhere in the ship. Even described the dolphin tank stellar cartography from the movies back in like the 70s and 80s. But that's way down in the weeds. You know, how do you turn that into a game for the most part? Like how, if I wanted to play a game of Star Trek, then how do I make a character who is a scientist in that dolphin stellar cartography area and then make it relevant for everything that we do going forward? Because I really like that sort of thing, and kind of where you try to bring the fantasy in on top of that science fiction is where you meet the border of the suspension of disbelief. Like
Hmm.
I can get into the weeds of describing everything down to a subatomic level for something in science fiction. One of my favorite book series, The Neutronium Alchemist, is very crunchy science fiction in that regard, you know. But if I want to bring someone who can levitate things with their minds and swing a laser sword, you know, do I everyone hates midichlorians. Midichlorians is the science fiction in the science fantasy of Star Wars. You
Yep,
know, it's a bacterial thing that gives the powers as opposed to space wizard because you believe hard. You know, and
that's a fantastic way to explain it, and I feel like that's part of what a major gripe without people realizing it is about the prequels and those explanations is like the beauty of original Star Wars is that they never bothered to explain anything. Um, you never have to worry about how an X-wing flies because it just does. Even in
right.
the extended universe stuff, like I am a huge fan of the former extended universe novels that are no longer canon
Mhm.
because for the most part they never bothered explaining anything unless it needed to be explained as a plot point, as RPG Hour said earlier. Whereas for sci-fi, like when I'm in the mood for sci-fi, I'm in the mood to know how things work. I'm in the mood to know why certain things work and why certain things don't. I'm in the mood to know why, if you break this certain law of physics, you're either going to do what you need to do or you're going to have a real bad time. I think the most fun I've had watching Star Wars was watching the light speed skip past a shield barrier in the new trilogy.
Love it.
I I love the new trilogy because they never explained why that would work, but it was just enough sci-fi for me to be like, all right, I can see it.
And I think it has to be done well,
Mm-hmm.
because Timothy Zahn, his novels add a little bit more science fictiony nature to some of the things in Star Wars, but it doesn't feel like you're being taken out of Star Wars. It just feels like it makes the Imperium feel more like a machine.
Mhm.
And I think that it's done well in that regard. On the flip side, Isaac Asimov wrote a series called Foundation. And in the
Hmm.
Foundation novels, there's a society that worships somebody that's like a barbarian. And this character is like, but they're sitting on a throne of technology. It's literally a computer. They're literally using, high end technology to do this. And the way that it's being explained and everything is done in a way that doesn't make you feel like the curtain is being pulled back. It makes you feel like you've known the curtain is pulled back the whole time, and you are now worried for these people. Is this person an actual believer that this is real? Or is this someone uh
Oh, did we lose the thing?
uh
No,
y'all continue talking. Apparently something happened with for some reason it thinks that I it says that we have 10 more minutes on our Zoom call, but we should have a lot longer.
Hmm.
that's no
Cue
problem.
technical difficulty screen.
I
Um,
know.
but
Well, well, I think my thoughts on that would be, and we kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, is the idea that science fantasy sets the rules for the eventual breaking of the rules as the turn in narrative, the twist for it, where science fiction, more pure science fiction, sets the rules as the actual framework for the story, and science fiction games do that as well. These are the lines that you color within for the story, for whatever's going on in pure science fiction. While in science fantasy, you just set that up so that when your hero or heroes, protagonist, antagonist, whatever the case may be, comes along to break things, then it's a big moment. You know.
agreed. Um, I feel like one of the most fun examples I've had of science fiction media lately was Horizon Zero Dawn. Um, and Horizon Zero Dawn was a very particular breed of science fiction, where it was post-apocalyptic. It was a very, I don't want to call it a narrow story, but it was a very trimmed down story than we're used to seeing in a lot of big science fiction. It didn't deal with like multiple planets or anything like that. It dealt with a particular area, dealt with a particular protagonist going through some societal issues and going through mostly a person versus wild, but the wild is all technology issue, which is extremely fascinating in its own right. And the reason why it worked so well is because Aloy, the main character, wasn't about to go do anything superhuman. All of the technology was aesthetically medieval, basically, bows and arrows and things like that. But all of it was also using scavenged parts from highly advanced, I would almost call them techno organic robots.
Mhm.
Whereas with regards to science fantasy, I'll go back to one of my favorites, and I will say this is science fantasy more than it is steampunk or anything like that, is the Dishonored series. And I say it's science fantasy more than it's steampunk or even um, I lost the word for it. More than it's steampunk, just because it has a magic element to it, which you don't often see in pure steampunk. You get that more out of like magipunk and things like that. So I
Hey,
consider
sorry.
that's
Time out real quick. I apparently logged in on the wrong account. So if we lose this, I will get it back up as soon as possible. Otherwise, y'all keep talking about things, but I'm gonna try and log in on this other account, and I hope that it doesn't crash our chat because it says I can just switch user without getting out of here. So, yeah, sorry. Keep going.
yeah. Dishonored's fantastic, and it has this very like close place in my heart because I loved the games, but also their overall aesthetic is very like, all right, so we have alternative fuel sources, we have some versions of electricity. We have in the second game, we have clockwork soldiers to worry about and entire like automated houses. But we also have this black-eyed outsider god who's going to give you void powers.
Right.
Um, and all of a sudden you can turn into a shadow beast or stop time. And like I absolutely adored that. Are they ever going to explain that? Well, I'm pretty sure that explanation isn't coming considering one of the DLCs murdered the void god, but you know, that happens.
And I think that Dishonored, they're coming out with a tabletop RPG, aren't there? There's
Modifius already did.
okay, okay.
I haven't had a chance to read it. I am fascinated in reading it, but Modifius is very lucky with the IPs they get to play with, in
Yeah.
my opinion.
Well, and also if you're not a big if you go look at it and you're like that's not a system for me, let's be 100% honest here. Uh, Blades in the Dark is very Dishonored feeling.
Oh yeah,
There's a lot of crossover there. There's not a whole lot you'd have to do to give it just that like little step up. I keep saying that I want to write up a special um, cruise sheet that's based around like Dishonored, the video games, and run
oh
a
that would be great.
Dishonored based Blades in the Dark game. Um, uh, but I have to replay it, and so like it's an excuse, but it's also like I have no time to play that right now. Like I barely have enough time to play 3 rounds of Among Us. How am I gonna get time to like play Dishonored and all the many hours of glory that it is? So, um, it's also like I wanna play Dead Space again. Um, but
Oh, Dead Space is such a great sci-fi horror thing going on. Like, sci-fi and horror have really deep roots together. And I think partially that's because sci-fi so often deals with the broad void of space and what could be out there. They both have that sense of what's going on beyond the reach of the firelight.
well, and not just that, but I also feel like science fantasy and space fantasy have a very close connection with horror as well because as soon as you get into this idea of there's powers or something, you almost immediately come back over to eldritch horrors and cosmic horrors and not even that all the time though because we have Event Horizon, which tickles at space fantasy. They explain things away. They have all that, but every time you get glimpses of the other world, it is absolutely just like wild out there.
Mhm.
Um,
DM Irene in Twitch chat, Frankenstein, horror novel, but also the first true science fiction novel. And then Rainey just said zombies. Zombies are the linking factor for all of it. And I mean, listen, Rainey, you don't have to call me out in chat when you know I'm working on a very like eldritch horror based zombie multiverse. It's fine. Um, but uh, zombies show up in like almost everything because both science fiction and science fantasy have a deep, deep fascination with what happens after we die,
Mhm.
or how quickly can we get to us dying in some cases as well.
well, and I'm gonna say something that's not a very popular opinion. I know that there is so many people that regard Frankenstein as the first science fiction novel. Um, and I'm gonna disagree. I think that it's our first
Interesting.
science fantasy novel. There is only so much that she actually dives into about the medical side of it because it's just this fantastical idea. And I think that it's more along the lines of I know that science fiction birthed itself from that, but I think that if we really look at it, it birthed science fantasy. And science fiction was like, we're going to focus on the science, but we had all these other cool horror things that came out of that as well.
Mhm.
And we have to look at the fact that science fantasy via Frankenstein birthed so much of what we have now for horror and science fiction.
Yeah, you hit kind of that point where it's the lightning did it. You know, the lightning brings Frankenstein to life, electricity, as opposed to going in depth on, the lightning's interactions with the various chemicals and everything that ties it all together that creates Frankenstein. Yeah.
Mhm. I'm gonna contest your point, RPG Hour. I'm gonna say it is the first science fiction novel because I would define it this way. I would say it's the first science fiction novel because it deals with the probable within the bounds of what was known at the time. So like there was no reason for them to think that like if you piece a body together and lightning strike it, it wouldn't come back to life. Because, by that point, the medical knowledge just it was getting there, but it wasn't quite there yet. I feel like a lot of science fiction plays with the probable or the possible within what we know is probable. I feel like a lot of science fantasy plays with the idea of what is improbable versus what we know is possible currently. And I feel like a lot of like horror or at least science fiction back.
There we go. Sorry, everybody. Like I said, it it looks like Zoom, even though I switched it over, did not catch it. And so, but I will say this:
Cool.
Valor is saying that he said your point, Crow, before you did in chat. So.
Yeah, well, I will also, considering that he said it, I'll just quote from him then. My understanding was that science fiction is making the improbable probable and fantasy is making the impossible possible, which can seem very much like the same statement unless you're an English literature nerd like me, at which point they become very different things. You know, science fiction always plays within the bounds of, yeah, I could see this happening. Whereas fantasy constantly plays with the bounds of, oh, that's weird, but it's really cool. Uh, Toddler does not care about church
Huh?
terms of service.
Okay,
This is
we'll close the door. All right. No, 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 no. With you outside of it, go find Mama, baby. I love you, but thank you for the cookies.
I absolutely I agree with from the standpoint of science, all things are probabilities. There is no impossibility. It's basically just how likely and unlikely, up to and through a degree of likeliness, So I I agree with the statement, but don't at the same time.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, in layman's terms, you agree with it. In
Right,
professional, you are an educated person of science terms. Nah, that's some bullshit.
right.
Uh, let's be honest here. But let me put it this way then. Maybe I kind of look at it as science fiction. Oh Lord, how can I word this? Science fiction centers around a degree of understanding. Science fantasy centers around a degree of awe at events, like awe and wonderment. Science horror, I'll call it, centers around the idea of fearing what we don't understand. And maybe I would split it up that way. Where science fantasy, I'll be honest, science fantasy tends to be much brighter and much more hopeful in strange ways than science fiction because it's less hard coded. There's more chance for the good guys to win. They don't always, that's where you get the darker stories, but the hope is there. Whereas for science fiction, there's always these kind of harder lines drawn where it's like, you really hope they can get out of this, but you know they can't get out of this unless they break the rules, and they aren't breaking the rules anytime soon. And then science horror is okay, they are outside their status quo now. We don't know what's going on. The rules have been broken in a way that is extremely egregious. What do we do? That's my take on the split between the three, I would say.
I absolutely agree with that, and I think the horror comes in where you were talking about sort of that awe and inspiration, where the horror is the violation of that awe and inspiration because you have the exploration, the exploratory portion of the science fiction and science fantasy, the finding, the discovery, but then I think I've been speaking in binaries all night. It's the idea of you discovering, or humanity, whoever the protagonist, discovering a thing versus being discovered by the thing coming upon you in a way that sort of
Oh, that is a
vi-
lovely, lovely thought.
it violates your principles and your understandings of who you are. So take going back to aliens, for instance. The whole thing with the alien, the I forget I keep coming back to Space Marines. Space Marines and aliens? I haven't seen aliens in a long
Uh, Only if we talk about the one video game that nobody ever wants to talk about.
time. Right, right. But the crew in the original Aliens, they have this sort of superiority. They're at the edge of technology. They're doing a thing. They have this arrogance about them, and the alien comes and violates that. All of the horror aspects of science fiction, science fantasy, is the violation of that all inspiration sort of utopian ideal, where the equivalent of that, going back to Star Trek, would be the Borg. Like
Hmm.
everything centering around Star Trek, you have the crew who are exemplary, exceptional. They always come up with an answer. They always, figure out not just the way to do something, but the absolute best way to do it. And if they don't, where it was just the impossible task, impossible situation, the Borg could come along and completely disrupt that. And that's what lends it to that they're one of my favorite zombies, because that's what it is. The Borg are a zombie story, you know.
Oh
And
yeah, that's really fair. I never actually considered them in the context of zombie stories, but you are absolutely right on that.
it's, because the whole thing with zombies is at any point you're infected, you're added
Yeah.
to the collective, to the horde of zombies. So it's a zombie story in a science fiction context, and it's in a way made more horrifying because that science fiction utopianism is it solves everything. It's solved world hunger. It's solved racism. It goes out there and it confronts these things that haven't, or people who haven't resolved those things. Well, here's something that you can't cure it until they do, of course, because they have to, because they had to be on the air for the next 7 years. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's also another thing too, is we're talking about, you know, creations that have intent behind them. We're talking about genres that are wildly different based on the intent of their creators. Like Star Trek changes wildly in its lore and can swing very much between like science fantasy, science horror, and science fiction depending on the episode because, they Star Trek for the longest time was Monster of the Week stories,
right.
uh, but on starships. Um, Scooby Doo in space, one might say. Uh, God, I hate that I made that
How
comparison.
how you could just park the mystery machine in the middle of a space shuttle and everybody just go, "Oh, Fred," is still beyond me. Like that is like pinnacle, like top of Scooby Doo.
I mean, I'm also just gonna put it out there. The original, like, next generation shuttles did look a bit like the Mystery Machine.
Well,
Just
absolutely.
saying. There's that. There's also like you just there's Q. Q is like anytime Q shows up is when things become science fantasy in Star Trek. Because he's that break in the rules that's not a negative break by any means. All of his episodes wind up being exceedingly positive in their outcomes, actually, which is kind of brighter and more hopeful the way science fantasy is. Going back to the Treasure Planet comparison, Treasure Planet is an extremely hopeful story, um, in the sense that it's not like in the sense that everyone hopes for something and those hopes are either met or not met by the end of the story.
I think personally for me, a something that I'd like to see come to tabletop role playing games would be John Carter. Um,
Oh,
I've read a couple of I've read, I think it's the second or third book in the series before I knew it was a series, and then I've read excerpts of other books and I've seen the movie, and it really is like a good like cross section of science fantasy. It's got just enough high tech to be like wow,
Mm-hmm.
and just enough like fantastical things to be like, oh, this is really cool. But the reason why I really like it is that in a lot of science fantasy, it is simply like this is the technology level, or this is a way high technology level, and we're just gonna try and figure out how it works. John Carter is somebody from a whole nother planet where the technology level is vastly different, and then he gets ported over to this other one, and he's met with people that whose technology level isn't that different from his. In fact, is a little bit less. And then there's people with like technology level that is way more advanced.
Hmm.
And I kind of like some of it. I'd have to definitely dive into the books more to say like what I think would be like a great system for it. But I kind of bounce personally between um, modding Classic Traveler, modding or using a toolkit system that does technology levels well, like GURPS, um, or doing something that's completely narrative based, like Fantasy. Um, Maybe Fate. My only issue with Fate at this point, after having had it run for me multiple times, is the dice. Um,
Yeah.
that's my only hiccup with Fate. But so I mean, John Carter would be mine. What about y'all? What is a science fantasy that doesn't already have a TTRPG that you'd like to see made into one?
Hmm.
And what system, if somebody was just to port it into a system, what system would you like to see it in?
It's a good question. You know what? For me, I would say the IP itself, which leans more fantasy until you start reading it and finding out that it has these science fiction underpinnings, are the Shannara series of books. Like you get further
Oh
in
yeah.
and you find
Yes.
out that like, oh, this is actually like post-apocalyptic Earth, and all these things have spun out of humanity, and they're basically mutations from radiation. And that way, a lot of it is Numenera, and it's related to other things. As far as the system, I don't have as much experience with other system non D20 systems, non D20 and D6, so I can't really pin it to everything. My first instinct is always to rip apart a D20 system and just, speaking of Frankenstein, to Frankenstein together the things that I like, you
Hmm.
know, until it functions in a way that, since I usually I'm DMing, I can tell the story the way that I want to within it, you know. But yeah, I wouldn't mind seeing that given a good treatment. What else?
I will say, if you haven't already seen it, the Shannara Chronicles, the series that they did,
Mhm.
they pull a lot of that undertone into it almost immediately. So you're not just like, which I mean, granted, depending on like what books you were real big fans of, um, but I'm a huge fan of a lot of the earlier stuff.
You're
So
right.
when I first watched the series, I had to pull the books back out, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I forgot that it gets like this at this point." Um, but it says that it's on Netflix, according to just stream it. Um, so for those of you that want to go watch that haven't read the books to find out what we're talking about, it does exist on season 1, and season 2 is on there. So
Nice.
Yeah, that was definitely one of those things where I was like, well, I didn't expect anyone to take this, childhood favorite property of mine and turn it into a thing. I think, and this relates back to a discussion. I forget if it was either on the Discord or on Twitter. Now that we're talking about it, I would say Pirates of the Dark Water. You
I
know,
haven't heard of that one actually.
yes,
yeah, because I mean, it is science fantasy to its core, and it's Treasure Planet, just like we're
Oh,
discussing.
lovely.
Yeah, thank you both of you for reminding me of Treasure Planet so that I'll have something to watch when I'm awake at like 3:30 in the morning. But
It's such a good movie though. It's so good. For me, like Dishonored is one of those things that I really wanted to see as a TTRPG, and I'm glad Modifius did it. It's also one of those things I don't think anyone could ever do right as a TTRPG, and I'll explain why. When you like a video game experience is a very different mold for storytelling than a TTRPG experience. When it comes to science fiction and fantasy in video games, in books, in these much more scripted and controlled environments, the science fiction and fantasy elements for me always are a backdrop until they are necessary to tell the story. With TTRPGs, that kind of flips a little bit. Everything is necessary because everything is the thing your players can bounce off of and will bounce off of at some point, even if it's just a vain thought in the back of your head. A vague thought, pardon me. So there's this weird difference in interaction you need. So I think Dishonored is a great one. I just don't think I feel like too many TTRPGs would be focused on replicating the gameplay of it and not enough on replicating the overall tone and vibe of it, which is probably why my choice to play a Dishonored TTRPG would be Blades in the Dark, because Blades in the Dark, did that better. Like RPGR brought up. One thing I'd love to see for science fantasy brought over is the sort of a summation of the Final Fantasy universe. Final Fantasy is like when I think quintessential science fantasy, that's where my brain goes because that was sort of my first introductions to the series when I was a kid, or when to the genre, I should say. And yes, it's like crystal punk fantasy stuff depending on which one you go to, but like even the early Final Fantasy games, like we look at Final Fantasy 6 and 7, those are all science fantasy to a T, especially 7. Like you get into like capitalist we're destroying the planet science fantasy with that one. And it would just be wonderful, but I don't think anyone would ever. Again, I feel like basing it off video games is a bad idea because too many people will focus on replicating gameplay instead of replicating vibe.
There was a fan version a number of years ago that was actually really, really good, in my opinion. It was a faster play style game. It was more focused on telling a story. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's like some older game systems that are out there. The heaviness of it was creating your character rather than playing the game. So it took a while to create the character, just like some older games are. But like once you get down to playing, it really is easy. Like it's a very simplistic how to do it. But it was never done anything beyond a fan thing because it uses an intellectual property. But there, it's difficult to find because when you search for it, it honestly comes up with like all the D&D versions or like the miniature game that was made.
Yeah.
There is a D6 version, and it's okay, but it's not. At least the D6 version that I had played, it was very much a just sort of copy of D&D with replaced with six-sided dice. It was
Yeah.
3d6 to roll, so you had 3 to 18.
I'll pose a question. What's a science fiction or science fantasy IP that uh, y'all don't think could be made into a TTRPG effectively,
Mm.
or would just take more work than it's worth to take that into a different track?
So I would say that the book series that I mentioned earlier, the Neutronium Alchemist,
Mhm.
because it is so hardcore science fiction, in its description of, the science that's at play in the work. Like, if you were to make it less crunchy so that it's functional as a game, a lot of people can play, then that actually takes away from some of the work itself because the nuts and bolts down to that level is what makes the series. It's what it's it's a big part of it. And unless you get together, basically five physics nerds who are all about, everything, down to that level, it kind of it loses some appeal. So I don't think you can really do it. Highly recommend it. You know, anyone go out there and read it. We're probably not supposed to be plugging things, but you know, yeah, go out there and check it out. Uh,
This stream is entirely unsponsored. We're just talking about things we like. Y'all know how it is.
Yeah, I don't think we're on the blip where we'd get in trouble for anything like that at this point. But I'm gonna say heavy metal. I didn't bring it up much
Okay.
during this, but heavy metal is actually my favorite science fantasy anthology. The both movies are really good, but I think the fact of the matter, the way that it works as an anthology, the way that it tells multiple stories, the way that the magazine worked, the way that it just is a set of different series. It's not meant to be a lasting story. It's meant to be like a real quick one shot, but the idea is that there's also like a weirdness interlaced through all of them, and I think that in all honesty it would be something really weird to play out, because when the second movie came out, the second movie was one story, and there are parts that feel like it dragged on, and like it's a cool movie, don't get me wrong, but I'm just like, okay, cool, like we're not getting a different story here, we're not seeing this orb that corrupts things corrupting another society. Instead, we're just getting like it kind of bouncing around and showing like, oh, this person did this thing or this thing. I feel like the second movie is what would happen if it turned into a tabletop role playing game, if somebody wrote it up, because you would have to simultaneously build a universal RPG system that was hyper focused on corruption via an orb, that the corruption comes and goes, or it literally just vaporizes you instantly.
Yeah, that would be extremely difficult to even just mechanize for a game.
Don't get me wrong, it would be fun to try.
That feels more like an experiment in futility. A fun one, but an experiment all the same. I'm gonna be a bit controversial, all things considered, and I'm gonna say Star Wars. And I'm not gonna say because I think people make bad Star Wars tabletop RPGs. I mean, we play what I think is a very serviceable one. I think it's because everyone who makes a Star Wars tabletop RPG tries to write too many goddamn rules to control the Force. Like you can't. So this is also an issue with the IP being bloated as all hell. I will say that much. With that many different hands working on the IP at any given time, the Force is a Deus Ex Machina every single time it's used. Regardless of how, every single time it's used, it's a Deus Ex Machina. For the simple reason that it will always do what the writers need it to do at any given point. And that is a concept that does not translate well to TTRPGs that are heavily rules based. So, up until this point, I think in order to run an effective Star Wars RPG or to create an effective Star Wars RPG, you need to have the balls to sit down and write a thing where it's like players spend this resource and do whatever the hell they want, which is not a kind of control that a lot of people are willing to give players, unfortunately. You might get systems that would be very good at that in the recent surge of indie TTRPGs, where people are getting much more comfortable with the idea of collaborative storytelling, but it just hasn't happened yet.
I'm going to say I slightly disagree, and only because the way that psionics worked back in Classic Traveler, back in the original way, was just that. You,
I'll agree with you there. I will wholeheartedly say you're right. I think the problem there is with perception because
yes.
people don't view the Force as psionics.
I was going to
People view
say,
psionics as having rules. Unfortunately, people don't really view the Force as having those rules, or they do and they try to create rules for it. It gets really flippy and meta from what I've seen. It's
well, that
strange.
that circles back around to what we were discussing earlier with the issue people have with the prequels versus everything, the originals and even the newer movies is that, Lucas set a mechanic to the Force where before the mechanic was if you believe hard enough, you can do things with it. It's basically if you believe hard enough, if you have enough faith, then you can literally lift mountains. And, The video games took it to a different extent. You can pull a Star Destroyer out of the sky because you believe hard enough or you are mad hard enough. And my favorite Star Wars system, and I think I've talked about it before, is the D20 Saga Edition system. I don't know if either of you ever really played it. It was basically the test bed for D&D Fourth Edition. So a lot of the things that people found really positive for Fourth Edition came out of Saga Edition, and it lets you build your character almost however you wanted. You multi-class into whatever class you wanted, pull whatever bits and bobs from it, and so your Jedi could be a combination scout, soldier, elite trooper, Jedi Knight sort of thing. That's what made your person. But the mechanic that I took from that system that I've used in just about everything that I've ever run is the Destiny mechanic, where basically you get a set amount of points, and just like you're saying, Crow, use the Force allows you to all but do whatever you want. The Destiny mechanic basically says, okay, you expend a point, and yeah, it activates powers, it does all this other stuff, but it basically hands you this meta narrative control in the moment when you expend this point. So now
Oh,
instead, yeah,
it's an actual like setting accurate plot point. Got it.
exactly. And then
I've played other games with plot points before, so it wasn't clicking for me until I heard that. Thank you.
no, exactly. That's exactly what it is. And it has additional mechanics surrounding it where, if you are supporting your destiny, then you get these bonuses. If you are fighting against your destiny, you get these negatives, but other bonuses for other things. And like you said, it sets that plot point. And I'm like, okay, I really like that. I've lifted that and put that in everything else that I run. Like, okay, everyone has this finite resource, and basically, if you want to expend one in this critical moment, you now can define a narrative thing. So that's extra turns, things, actions outside of there. Deus Ex Machina, where you can summon additional help, that sort of thing. And I really, really like that, and it has just enough loosey goosey narrative based stuff that you know satisfies my need for storytelling, but also my need for all the crunchy, math rock throwing intensive stuff that I like in the system as well. So and but their whole design ethos, yeah, design ethos was we will make the gameplay hue as close to the movie cinematics as possible. So all of the mechanics should mirror something that we at least have seen on the screen in some facet, even though it used the old expanding universe. We'll take those things from the old expanding universe and mechanically try to fit them into something that could fit in the movie cinematics, the visualization. I'm like, okay, didn't work always. There was a bunch of stuff that became very, very broken, but
I mean, yeah.
So we've actually gone over time. If y'all want to plug your personal stuff right quick.
Absolutely. So my name is Cliff. You can find me on Twitter at SpaceMoose34. I do creation and editorial work with Spilled Ale Games, which you can also find at Spilled Ale on Twitter.
Yeah, I'm Eric, also known as Crow. You can find me on the. You can find all of us on the upcoming Star Wars Legacies podcast here on RPG Hour. Go check it out. It's a lot of fun. I play a sugar addicted clone trooper. It's a fun time. I also do some content creation. I just started streaming recently, so you can find me on Twitch at Eldritch Crow. Been playing Hades and doing some game dev talks over that. I'm also creating my own ttrpg, which is cards based. It's going to be heroic fantasy and all that fun stuff, just because I love it. That's all. So you can find me on Twitter. I do have a website, eldritchcrow.com, which I need to get better at updating. But you can find all of the info there.
So the first episodes that are currently dropping of Star Wars Legacies is actually out. We do not have the amazing runt on those. It is our Halloween Tin Candles special edition stuff. But starting next month, we will be dropping the regular episodes, and those will be on the first and third Tuesdays of the month. And we're going to release every other week for a little while, and then As if people seem to like it, then we will actually go to weekly. Not that we aren't producing enough content to go weekly, but editing out the ums and the uhs can actually reduce by quite a little bit. We are all part of RPG Hour Studios in one way, shape, or form. You can find us at rpghour.com. You can find us on social media, RPG Hour. We have a Discord where we goof off and talk about the shows on there. And our new thing is we switched over to transistor.fm. We can actually host all of our shows for the same price rather than having a bunch of prices. They are not a sponsor, but if you're looking to get into podcasting, that is honestly the way to go. And until the dice roll again.